The night was colder than most people expected, the kind of cold that slowly slips into your hands and feet, even through gloves and socks. The streetlights flickered above the empty road, casting weak yellow light onto cracked sidewalks and closed shop doors. A wind pushed old paper cups and plastic bags along the ground, as if the city itself was restless. In a quiet corner near a small grocery store that had shut down hours ago, a cardboard box sat unnoticed. It wasn't new. It was worn slightly, torn at the sides, and looked like it had been pulled from a pile of trash. Most people walking by saw it only as that trash. Something easy to ignore inside the box was a small child. The child was sleeping, curled up to stay warm. A thin, faded blanket covered the tiny body. The blanket had holes, and the fabric had gone stiff from dirt and age. The child's small hands were tucked under the chin, trying to hold in whatever warmth was left. The soft sound of breathing mixed quietly with the sound of the wind. The shoes were too big. They slipped half off the feet and had a broken lace. The jacket was not meant for winter. It was the kind of jacket worn in early fall, when the air is still mild and gentle. In the freezing night, it served little purpose other than making the child feel less alone. Cars moved down the road, headlights flashing across the walls. A few people walked past, pulling their coats closer around themselves. They were tired. They had worked long hours. They were thinking about warm dinners, heated rooms, and soft beds waiting at home. None of them stopped. Some looked down for a split second. Some slowed just a little, but their steps never truly paused. Not enough to notice the small rise and fall of the blanket. Not enough to see the tiny fingers move slightly in sleep. The city was used to ignoring things. In the distance, a train passed, its sound low and heavy. The child stirred slightly, but did not wake. The face was peaceful in a strange way, as if sleep was the only safe place left. The cheeks were pale, and the lips were dry and cracked from the cold. There was no bag of belongings, no plastic sack of clothes, no sign of a family nearby. It's just the box, the blanket, and the quiet breathing of a child. Across the street, a bakery's sign flickered on and off. The smell of old bread still lingered faintly in the air. The child shifted again, maybe dreaming of warmth, maybe dreaming of food, maybe just trying to escape the cold in that small, fragile way children do. The wind grew stronger. The cardboard box moved slightly, scratching softly against the concrete. If anyone had been watching, they might have seen the sadness of that moment. The street was mostly empty, and the world, for that moment, felt very far away from that little box. A man walked past, staring straight ahead. A woman walked by while talking quietly on her phone. A delivery worker rolled by on a bike. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone had something to think about. No one stopped. The child's fingers trembled slightly. The blanket slipped a little, exposing the thin sleeve of the jacket. The skin looked cold to the touch. The child's breathing became softer, slower, fragile like glass. Above, the sky was dark and clouded. No stars could be seen. The street lamp, closest to the box, flickered harder now, making the shadows move like slow waves on the wall behind. Then, from far down the street, footsteps could be heard. Not rushed, not hurried, just calm, steady steps. Someone was coming slowly, but for now the child remained asleep in the cardboard box, surrounded by cold air, passing cars, and a world that had not yet decided to notice. The footsteps grew closer, soft and careful against the cracked pavement. The person walking did not rush, and there was a strange kind of calm in each step, as if the night had slowed the world just for them. They were carrying nothing but a small bag, not large or heavy, but enough to suggest someone who had come prepared for small acts, quiet gestures. As they approached the corner, they saw the box. At first they thought it was just trash, old cardboard left over from deliveries or broken furniture. But then something made them stop. The outline inside the box was too soft, too human to be ignored. The blanket moved slightly, rising and falling with a slow, uneven rhythm. The figure froze, a heartbeat caught in the cold air. The person bent closer, keeping a careful distance at first. Their eyes scanned the child, noticing the way the tiny chest moved under the thin fabric, the way the hands were curled near the face. There was something about the stillness, the fragility, that made them take a step back. The wind gusted, and the blanket lifted a little, revealing the pale skin beneath. A shiver ran through the person as they realized how cold the child must be. For a moment, the world felt quiet. No cars passed. The wind seemed to pause. Even the flickering street lamp above held steady, as if the city had decided to watch this scene unfold. The person knelt down, careful not to wake the child. They rested. One hand lightly on the corner of the blanket, adjusting it without disturbing the tiny body beneath. The touch was gentle, careful, almost reverent. It was a simple act, one that took only a second, but it carried the weight of concern, of recognition, of care. They looked around, expecting maybe someone to notice, someone ask why they were kneeling in the middle of the street at this hour. But the street remained empty, quiet, indifferent. And in that silence, the person felt both relief and a growing sense of responsibility. They reached into their bags slowly, pulling out a small thermos of warm tea. It wasn't much, not enough, to make a difference in the freezing night, but it was something. They set it beside the box, careful not to spill a drop, and whispered softly, almost to themselves, that it was okay, that help would come. That the child was not alone. The child shifted slightly in sleep, murmuring something soft and incomprehensible. The person's heart tightened. They had seen sadness before, but there was something about a sleeping child, so small and unprotected, that cut deeper than most things in life. It was pure vulnerability, a kind of honesty that the world often ignored. They stayed there for a long moment, just watching, breathing slowly, willing themselves to remain calm so as not to disturb the fragile peace. Their mind ran through questions they could not answer. Who had left the child here? Where was the family? Had the child been hungry? Cold? Scared? They didn't have answers, only the certainty that they could not leave. After a while, they looked around again, searching for anyone who might help. The street was still empty. The lights from nearby windows offered no warmth, only muted reflections on the icy pavement. Everything felt distant but somehow closer at the same time. The box with the child inside became the center of the world. A small planet in the middle of a city that had almost forgotten how to notice. The person took a deep breath, steadying themselves. They reached for the blanket again, carefully tucking it around the child, adjusting the thin folds to cover the exposed skin. The hands that did this were steady now, familiar with small, quiet acts of care. It was not heroic, not dramatic. There were no cameras, no applause, no recognition. Just the simple, human desire to protect someone who could not protect themselves. Then the person did something more. They pulled a small notebook from their bag, flipping it open carefully. With a pencil, they wrote down a note, short and simple, describing what they had seen and leaving instructions for anyone who might come after. Child sleeping. Cold, needs help. They placed the note in a clear plastic sleeve, setting it gently beside the box. It was a small act, but it carried thoughtfulness, planning. It's the hope that someone would follow through. They paused again, watching the child. The small rise and fall of the chest, the faint shiver that still ran through the tiny body, the soft sound of breathing that seemed almost fragile, all of it made their heart ache. And yet there was something in the stillness that gave hope. The child was alive. The child was breathing. The child had survived this far. As minutes passed, the person stayed nearby, neither too close nor too far. They shifted their weight from one knee to the other, hands brushing against the warm lining of their jacket. The city remained quiet. Occasionally a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the street. The person ducked slightly, hoping not to disturb the fragile moment. They whispered softly again, words that were not meant for anyone else. It's okay. You're safe for now. You're not alone. The child stirred a little, letting out a small sigh, but did not wake fully. It was enough for the person to know that their presence mattered. That simply being there, quietly, was already an act of protection. Time passed slowly. The wind continued to blow, curling around corners, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and distant bread from a closed bakery. The person kept watch, imagining the warmth of a home, the comfort of a bed, the safety of someone who cares. All of it seemed so far away for the child, yet so close within reach, if only someone continued to notice. They thought about the night ahead. How long could the child stay here before the cold became too much? Could someone else pass by and offer more help? The answers were uncertain. The world felt large and indifferent, but in this small corner, in the quiet of a winter night, it felt like the world had narrowed down to one small, vulnerable life. And so, they stayed. Not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because it was necessary. They shifted slightly, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face, making sure the blanket did not slip again. They imagined the child waking up in a warmer place, imagining someone to hold them, imagining laughter instead of shivers. The night deepened. Shadows stretched longer along the walls, and the flickering streetlight above seemed to dim and brighten in gentle rhythm. The city slept, unaware of the small drama unfolding on the sidewalk. And yet, in that quiet, two beings shared a silent understanding. One small life was precious. One act of care could matter more than anything else the world offered. The person did not move away, did not step back. They remained a quiet guardian in the cold, watching over the child as the hours passed. They whispered once more softly, a promise they could not yet fulfill fully, but one they intended to honor. You are safe now. I am here. You are not alone. And in that moment, the child continued to sleep, wrapped in a thin, fragile blanket, unaware that a simple, quiet act of care had already begun to change the course of a night, a life, and maybe even the future. The first light of morning was slow to arrive, as if the city itself had decided to give the night a little more time. The wind had calmed, leaving only the faint echo of distant cars and the soft rustle of trash along the sidewalk. The person who had stayed through the night now sat on the cold pavement, legs folded, eyes fixed on the small cardboard box. The child inside stirred occasionally, shifting slightly under the thin blanket, still too small and fragile to move with purpose. The person felt the weight of responsibility in every quiet sound. Even the faintest sigh from the child made their heart tighten. They reached into the small bag beside them and pulled out a thicker blanket, one that had been folded carefully. It was not much, but it was warmer, softer. And for a moment, the person imagined it wrapped snugly around the child's small shoulders, holding them safe against the cold. Gently, with careful hands, they lifted the child from the box. The little body was light and fragile, trembling from the chill. The person wrapped the child in the new blanket, tucking the edges around the tiny frame, making sure no part of the skin was exposed. The child stirred, eyes fluttering open, unsure and still half in sleep. When they saw the gentle face leaning over them, there was a flicker of confusion, then cautious recognition. The child did not speak, did not cry, only looked up with wide, uncertain eyes. The person smiled softly, speaking in the quietest tone. It's okay. You're safe now. No one will hurt you. The words felt small against the vastness of the city, but they carried intention. They offered comfort in a place where comfort had been absent for far too long. The child blinked, eyes adjusting to the dim light, let out a soft sigh, curling slightly closer to the warmth that had been offered. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. The person thought about what had brought the child here, how long they had been alone, what they had felt through the cold night. But there was no point in dwelling on questions with no answers. The only thing that mattered now was the present, the immediate act of care that could change the course of the day, maybe even life. They lifted the child carefully and began to walk toward a nearby cafe that had recently opened for the morning. The streets were still quiet, but the faint hum of the waking city reached them. Cars began to move more quickly. Footsteps picked up, but the person stayed calm, holding the child gently, ensuring that no sudden movement would frighten them. Every step was measured, thoughtful, deliberate. When they reached the cafe, the owner, A quiet middle-aged person with kind eyes noticed immediately. They stepped forward, concern written across their face. The person explained softly, carefully, not wanting to alarm anyone but needing help. The owner nodded, moving quickly to prepare a small area with blankets and a warm cup of milk. The child hesitated, unsure of the sudden movement, the new faces, the unfamiliar space. But the person stayed close, whispering soft words of reassurance. Slowly, hesitantly, the child allowed themselves to drink the milk, the warmth seeping into their small body. Their tiny hands wrapped around the cup, gripping it carefully, and for a moment, there was a quiet sense of peace. The person watched intently, noticing every small reaction, the way the child's lips curved slightly as the warmth reached them, the soft blink of tired eyes, the deepening of breath as comfort began to replace fear. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was enough to show that small acts of care could carry immense power. After the milk, the person helped the child eat a simple breakfast. The child's hands were clumsy, movements uncertain, but the person guided them patiently, never rushing, always gentle. Every bite seemed to restore a small piece of confidence, small piece of hope. Once the child had eaten, the person reached into the bag again and pulled out a few clean clothes. They were modest, simple garments, but dry and warm. The child allowed themselves to be dressed, trusting the person who had been there all night. The transformation was quiet, understated, but visible. The child's eyes, once clouded with uncertainty, now showed a hint of relief, a small glimmer of comfort. The person knew this was only the beginning. There was more to do, more care to provide, more steps towards safety and stability. They had already called a nearby shelter, ensuring that someone would come to help, to provide a safe place for the child to stay. But until help arrived, they remained by the child's side, offering warmth, presence, and reassurance. Hours passed slowly, but the child began to relax. Small signs of comfort emerged: a soft yawn, a stretch of tiny arms, a sigh that seemed less burdened. The person allowed themselves a quiet smile, knowing that these moments were fragile, yet powerful. They were building trust, piece by piece, showing the child that there was kindness, that not everyone ignored suffering, that compassion could exist even in the cold. In different city, outside the city continued to wake. Voices of mourning travelers echoed through streets, doors opened and closed, cars honked softly. But inside the small cafe, there was stillness, a bubble of care surrounding the child. For the first time in a long while, the child felt watched over, protected, and seen. The person thought about the cardboard box left on the street, the shiver, the silence, the night that had been. They felt a pang of sadness, but it was coupled with resolve. They could not undo the past, but they could shape the present, could offer safety, could show love in a world that often ignored the smallest, most vulnerable voices. As morning deepened into mid-morning, the shelter arrived. A kind, calm worker entered the cafe, kneeling to speak gently to the child. The person introduced the child, explaining the night, the care, the moments of fear and comfort. The shelter worker listened attentively, taking notes, but more importantly, offering a presence of trust. Someone who could carry forward the warmth and safety that had begun here. The child clung briefly to the person who had stayed through the night, a gesture of trust and gratitude that needed no words. The person held the child's hand, whispering softly one last time, "You are safe. You are not alone. You will be cared for." The child nodded, understanding more in silence than anyone could speak aloud. The handover was gentle. The shelter worker promised warmth, food, and a safe bed. The person stayed until the child felt comfortable enough to move, then quietly stepped back. They watched as the child was led away, small but steady steps now taken with a sense of security. The cafe returned to normal. The city moved on, but the memory of the night, the quiet presence, the small acts of care remained. It was proof that even a simple gesture, staying through the night, offering warmth, offering attention, could shift the course of a life. No matter how fragile, the person left the cafe, carrying nothing but the memory of a small body sleeping safely for the first time in a long while. The street, once cold and indifferent, now held traces of hope. And though the child's journey had only just begun, that first morning was a quiet, undeniable turning point, a reminder that compassion, gentle and unwavering, could change everything. The shelter was quiet when the child arrived, but it was nothing like the cold streets or the lonely cardboard box. Inside, the air was warmer, softer, carrying the faint smell of blankets and cleaning soap and a quiet hum of life that was slow, patient, and careful. The child looked around with cautious eyes, noticing the other children in the room. Some reading, some quietly drawing, some curled up under warm blankets. Each face told a story, some happier, some sadder, but all contained small pieces of hope. A worker greeted the child gently, kneeling to speak softly. "You're safe here. You don't need to be afraid." The words were repeated often in the shelter, but they carried weight, especially when spoken with calmness and patience. The child stayed close to the person who had helped them through the night, holding a small hand until the worker smiled warmly, offering reassurance that staying was not a punishment, that it was a beginning. At first, everything felt strange. The bed was soft and warm, the blankets clean, the sheets smelling of gentle soap. The child hesitated, unsure if this comfort was real or temporary. But slowly, they climbed into the bed, curling under the blanket, letting it cover their small body fully for the first time in days. Sleep came easily that morning, deep and restful, without the fear of cold air or the sharp edges of a cardboard box. Over the next few days, routines formed. Meals came at regular times, not just small bits of bread or milk, but warm, nutritious food. The child learned to eat carefully, slowly, because the body had grown weak from hunger, but also because there was no rush, no danger pressing in. The worker spoke gently while guiding each meal, teaching patience, explaining safety, encouraging small steps of trust. Slowly, trust began to grow in ways too subtle to notice immediately. The child began to speak, first in quiet whispers, then in small sentences, each word a careful bridge toward connection. They asked questions, sometimes small, sometimes big, about the world outside the shelter, about the people who had ignored them, about the cold night they had survived. Each question was met with gentle answers, never judgment, only care. Other children in the shelter noticed too. Some approached hesitantly, offering small gestures, a shared toy, a smile, an invitation to join a game. The child sometimes accepted, sometimes withdrew, learning slowly how to navigate this new world of safety and warmth. Each day was a small lesson in trust, in human connection, in the fact that not everyone left you to struggle alone. Outside the shelter, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet transformations happening within the walls. The streets were busy, the cars loud, the shops open, but inside, time moved differently. Hours were measured not in deadlines or obligations, but in meals, in sleep, in small acts of attention, in gentle conversations that reminded the child that they mattered. One afternoon, the child was given a small notebook and some colored pencils. At first, the pages remained blank, the pencils untouched, but slowly, images began to appear, small drawings of streets, of houses, of the cardboard box they had once known. The person who had helped them noticed and knelt beside the child, encouraging quietly, "Draw what you feel. It's safe here." So the images became a language, a way to express fear, hope, sadness, and the beginnings of joy. The child began to notice other things too, the softness of blankets, the warmth of food, the calm voice of someone who spoke without anger, the safety of a roof over their head. Each small discovery was a victory, a proof that life could be different, better, gentler than before. The nights became easier, no longer filled with trembling shivers or fear of passing strangers. Sleep became deep and restful, restoring the strength that had been lost. The person who had stayed with the child through the night continued to visit, quietly, never rushing, never forcing. They brought small gestures, a warm scarf, a piece of fruit, a simple story read aloud. Each visit reminded the child that they were not alone. that one small act of care could ripple into days of comfort. Weeks of trust, years of possibility. Slowly, other children began to include the child in small routines, showing them how to play, how to share, how to communicate without fear. Laughter returned in small amounts, quiet giggles that seemed fragile but grew louder with each passing day. The child began to sleep without fear, wake without trembling, eat without anxiety, speak without hesitation. The staff noticed the changes too. The child who had arrived shivering and hesitant was beginning to smile, beginning to ask questions, beginning to reach out. The gestures were smaller hand held in greeting, a soft laugh at a joke, a tentative offer to share a toy, but they were proof that trust was growing. Slowly but steadily, even outside the walls of the shelter, hope was being rebuilt. The child began to imagine a life beyond the streets, beyond the cold night, beyond the cardboard box that had once been home. The mind, once focused solely on survival, began to dream. The child imagined learning to read, imagined playing outside without fear, imagined feeling safe at all hours. Each dream was fragile, yet stronger than the cold they had endured. The person who had helped them watched quietly, never needing praise, only satisfaction in knowing that their gentle act had begun a chain of change. They understood that healing was a slow process, that one night of care was only the first step in a long journey. But seeing the child eat, play, sleep, and laugh, even in small doses, proved that kindness could persist in the harshest of environments. Weeks passed. The child grew stronger, more confident, more willing to trust. The staff at the shelter encouraged small routines, teaching basic life skills, offering lessons in communication and understanding, but always with patience. There were no demands, no expectations beyond safety and learning to care for oneself. And yet, the child began to notice something else, how the world could be gentle, how humans could care without expectation, how a single act of attention could change the course of life. That first night, the cardboard box, the blanket, the warmth offered everything. It started a transformation that no one could have predicted. By the time the child began to sleep without fear, play without hesitation, and speak with confidence, it became clear that the shelter had become more than a temporary refuge. It had become a place of beginnings, a place of safety, a place where life could be rebuilt one small step at a time. The city continued outside, unaware of the quiet miracles happening within its walls. But inside, a life had already begun to change. One small act of care, one night spent sitting beside a fragile child, had set in motion a series of transformations that would ripple outward, slowly, gently, inevitably shaping a future filled with hope, trust, and the possibility of joy. Months passed, and the child had grown stronger, both in body and in spirit. The timid, fragile person who had once curled inside a cardboard box was slowly transforming into someone who could look up, speak, and even smile with confidence. The shelter had become more than a safe place. It had become a home in a way that was quiet and steady. There were routines now, meals at fixed times, study hours, play sessions, and evenings filled with gentle conversation or reading. Each day carried a rhythm that offered predictability, something the child had never known before. The child had begun to understand trust. At first it was small, letting a worker hold their hand, speaking a sentence without fear, sharing a drawing with someone new. Then it grew larger, joining a group of children for games, participating in small tasks around the shelter, offering to help clean up or organize books. Every action, no matter how tiny, built a foundation of confidence. The child was learning to believe in their own ability to navigate the world safely. And every encouraging smile from a staff member reinforced that belief. But the world outside still waited. The city was loud, indifferent, and often overwhelming. The child sometimes asked questions about the streets, the nights spent cold, the people who had passed without noticing. The workers answered gently, focusing on understanding rather than blame. "You survived," they said. "You are here now, and you are safe. That is what matters." Slowly, the child learned that the past could not be changed, but the future could be shaped through care, attention, and effort. The person who had found the child that cold night continued to visit, though they never interfered with the shelter's routines. They would bring small gifts, a warm scarf, a piece of fruit, or a story read aloud. Each visit reinforced a vital truth, that someone had chosen to care, and that act of care was not fleeting. It was constant, patient, and deliberate. And in those moments, the child learned the most important lesson of all, that one person's kindness could ripple outward, touching life in ways that were not always visible at first. One afternoon, the child was asked to participate in a small community activity organized by the shelter. Children from the neighborhood were invited to come, learn, play, and share. At first, the child hesitated. Crowds, new faces, and loud voices were intimidating. But the person who had stayed beside the child through that first cold night offered a gentle reminder: "You are ready. You are safe. You can try." With that encouragement, the child stepped forward. The day was long, filled with games, laughter, and learning. The child discovered that they could run, play, and even win a small game of tag. The exhilaration of movement, of being part of a group, was something entirely new. At the end of the day, the child sat quietly under a tree, catching their breath, watching the other children. For the first time, they felt like they belonged, not just physically, but emotionally. They belonged somewhere in the world. At night, when the shelter was calm again, the child thought about everything that had happened. About the box on the street, the cold night, the person who had stayed beside them, the warmth of the shelter, the laughter of new friends. Each memory was a thread in a growing tapestry of understanding. Life could be harsh. Life could also be gentle. Life could also be nurturing. The contrast made each act of kindness feel even more powerful, more real, more transformative. Months turned into a year. The child's growth was not only physical, but emotional and intellectual. They learned to read and write fluently, explored new ideas, and began to dream beyond mere survival. They wanted to help others, to offer care as it had been offered to them, to prevent anyone else from feeling the fear and cold that they had once endured. Teachers and workers at the shelter noticed the quiet determination growing in the child, recognizing that these early experiences, painful as they were, had instilled a rare empathy. The person who had first found the child watched these changes silently, quiet satisfaction filling them. They never needed recognition, never asked for thanks. Their gift had been simple: time, attention, presence, and yet the results were profound. The child, once helpless and alone, was now capable of independent thought, compassion, and action. The ripple of that single night of care had spread through weeks, months, and into the shaping of a young life. One day, the child was given an opportunity to volunteer at the shelter itself. At first, it was a small role, handing out meals, organizing toys, tidying the play area. But the child approached each task with care, patience, and attention, mirroring the kindness that had been shown to them. Other children watched in awe, learning from example. Slowly, the child's actions inspired a quiet transformation in others. Small acts of attention, small gestures of care, all contributing to a more nurturing environment. Through these experiences, the child began to understand a truth that would guide their life forever. That one gentle act, no matter how small, could change someone's path. That the world was not only cold and indifferent, but also capable of warmth and transformation when someone chose to act with empathy. Years later, the child, now grown, carried these lessons into the broader world. They worked with families, children, and communities, dedicating themselves to ensuring that no one would feel the fear and loneliness they once had. Each intervention, each helping hand, each moment of patience reflected the care they had received on that long-ago night. They never forgot the quiet figure who had knelt beside a cardboard box in the cold, offering presence and warmth. That memory remained a guide, a compass, and a source of motivation. Even as adults, they returned occasionally to the shelter, speaking to children, offering encouragement, and showing that hope could be rebuilt. And when they did, they would tell the story of one child, a cardboard box, and a single act of gentle care, illustrating that the smallest gestures could echo through a lifetime in the end. The transformation was quiet, gradual, and human. No headlines, no grand ceremonies, no public recognition. Only the truth that kindness matters, that care persists, that one act can create a ripple that shapes the future. The child's journey had begun in fear and cold, but it continued in warmth, trust, and the ongoing opportunity to offer the same gift they had once received. The gift of gentle attention and the understanding that someone sees you, someone cares, and someone chooses to stay. The streets remained busy, the city unchanged in its rhythm, but somewhere, a life had been altered forever. That life, once small and fragile, now carried the capacity to touch others, to guide, to inspire, and it all began with one quiet night, one cardboard box, and the choice of one person to act with care when no one else would. The child had learned to trust, to hope, to dream, and ultimately to give back. And that was the most lasting change of all. Even as the child, now older, grew stronger and more confident. Life continued to offer challenges, small and large. The shelter had been a place of safety, warmth, and healing, but the wider world was still unpredictable. Every day brought lessons, not all of them easy, not all of them expected. Yet the child had learned, through the gentle acts of one person on a cold night, that compassion could carry more weight than fear, and that even small choices could change the course of a life. Morning routines remained important. Waking up in a warm bed, surrounded by blankets that smelled faintly of soap and comfort, had become normal. But the child, now taller, more aware, began to notice other things. The expressions on the faces of workers who carried kindness in their eyes. The quiet laughter of other children who had learned to trust. The little victories that happened every day when someone made the effort to help. Each detail became a building block of understanding, shaping the way the child thought about people, about life, and about themselves. The child's education had become a new world. They learned to read books not only for knowledge, but for imagination. Discovering stories of kindness, courage, and resilience. They studied mathematics, science, and history, but they also studied empathy, patience, and emotional understanding. Each lesson revealed a world beyond survival, a world where they could imagine possibilities, plan for the future, and contribute in meaningful ways. But growth was not linear. Some days, shadows of fear and loneliness returned. Memories of the cold night, the cardboard box, the trembling uncertainty, all of it surfaced unexpectedly. On those days, the child would pause, sit quietly under the shelter's tree, and breathe. The workers never forced conversation. They only offered presence, understanding that healing sometimes required stillness. On such days, even the smallest comfort, a soft word, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a warm meal was enough to bring the child back to hope. The person who had first found the child continued their quiet visits. They never asked for recognition, never demanded attention. Sometimes they simply sat nearby, reading a book while the child played or worked. Other times they offered a story, a piece of fruit, or a small item of clothing. Each gesture reinforced what the child was learning, that care could exist without expectation, that love could be patient, steady, and enduring. The child began to understand that the world was not only a place of fear, but also a place of possibility. Over time, the child began to take small steps toward helping others. At first, it was as simple as offering a hand to a younger child, sharing a snack, or helping tidy a space. Then it became more intentional, volunteering to assist during mealtimes, helping new children adjust to the shelter, and even offering quiet words of encouragement to someone who seemed frightened. Each act, though small, reinforced a powerful truth: kindness spreads, often in ways that cannot be immediately measured. School visits from outside. Volunteers began to influence the child's vision of the world. They met teachers, social workers, and other children who had overcome difficulties. Listening to these stories, the child realized that hardship was not a unique burden They were part of a larger community of resilience. And yet, they also recognized that every story shared was built on someone's choice to act with care, just as someone had chosen to act for them. At night, in the quiet of the shelter, the child reflected on what had been learned so far. They thought about the streets, the cold, the cardboard box. They remembered the fear, the hunger, the trembling shivers. And then they remembered the warmth, the gentle touch, the soft voice of the person who had stayed beside them. That night of care had created ripples that had carried through months of growth. Through learning, through building trust, and through discovering the power of compassion, one afternoon, the child, now older and taller, was asked to help a new child who had just arrived at the shelter. The small visitor looked frightened, hesitant, and unsure. The older child knelt down, speaking softly. "It's okay. You are safe. You are not alone." So they offered a blanket and a piece of fruit. They realized something profound. Their own experience had prepared them to offer what they had once received. The cycle of care was continuing. Time passed, and the older child began to take more responsibility within the shelter. They helped organize meals, supervised small playgroups, and assisted in reading lessons. Each task was performed with patience, gentleness, and awareness of what small gestures could mean to someone who had known fear and loneliness. They had learned that attention mattered, that being present mattered, that the smallest act could hold tremendous power in the life of another. Outside the shelter, life continued, indifferent, yet filled with possibility. The streets remained busy, the city unchanged, but within the shelter's walls, lives were being rebuilt quietly, one day at a time. The older child understood that safety, warmth, and care were not privileges, but essential tools to help someone heal. They learned to listen, to offer patience, to notice the small signs of fear or need in someone else. And they did this not for recognition, not for reward, but because they had experienced the impact of such acts themselves. As the older child continued to grow, they began to imagine a future beyond the shelter. They wanted to study, to learn more, to help not only children in the shelter, but families, communities, and neighborhoods that faced similar struggles. They dreamed of creating safe spaces where care and understanding were not rare, but natural. Each ambition was built on the foundation of one quiet night, one cardboard box, and one act of gentle care that had changed everything. The person who had stayed beside them that first night continued to visit occasionally, watching quietly as the child became a young person capable of giving care in return. They never interfered, never claimed ownership of the transformation. But their presence remained a reminder that simple acts mattered more than we often realize. And the child understood that their journey, though theirs to walk, has been made possible by someone else's choice to act when it was needed most. The older child's confidence grew steadily. They learned to speak in public, to share their story, to advocate for others who might not have a voice. Each word carried weight, each action carried intention. The memories of fear were not erased, but they were transformed into understanding, empathy, and a drive to ensure that no one else felt so unseen, so cold, so forgotten. Eventually, the young person began mentoring others who had experienced hardship. They guided new children arriving at the shelter, offered comfort, and provided practical assistance. Their gentle, patient approach reflected the lessons learned, that transformation is not instant, that trust takes time, and that even the smallest gestures can have lasting impact. The city continued to bustle, largely unaware of these quiet ripples, but inside the shelter and inside the hearts of those who had been helped, life was changing. The cycle of care begun on one cold night had continued, expanding outward, touching lives and creating hope. And the older child, once fragile and alone, now understood that life's difficulties could be met not only with resilience, but also with compassion, patience, and kindness. Years later, as an adult, they would reflect on that first night. They would remember the cold, the fear, the trembling, and the cardboard box. And they would remember the one person who had chosen to stay, to care, to act. That memory became a guiding force in their life, shaping choices, inspiring actions. and reminding them that every small gesture has the potential to change a life. And so, the story continued not as a single event, but as a ripple, spreading through years, through generations, through every quiet act of attention and care. The young person had learned, fully and deeply, that one gentle action could grow into a lifetime of impact, and that every life, no matter how small or fragile, could be transformed by kindness, patience, and unwavering care.